What the hell happened to World War III? This was a game tipped to take on Battlefield 5 and provide players with a satisfying modern military shooter with flavours of Battlefield, Squad and Armour all mixed into one. Yes, the project was ambitious from the start, but so are many others in the current gaming environment. From what I could tell on first inspection, the game was actually quite decent, and although there were clearly issues in need of addressing and updates required, the ingredients for a fun experience were there for all to see. I even made several videos on it, which is fairly rare for me to do, as I don't often venture outside of the Battlefield franchise. It had my attention, and that of many other content creators, but then the lights went out, and the player numbers plummeted. It is fair to say that right now World War III is a dead game. It's a sad truth that many people will be unhappy to hear, but that's just that. In this video I'm going to bring you a bit of footage from when the game was playable, so it's not footage from the current build of the game, it's from September or October last year, and I'll explain a little more about that in a minute, and then discuss what went wrong and what it might mean for ambitious projects like this in the future. Starting out, I have to say, World War III was a very promising early access game. It was not made by a AAA studio, and from day one it was evident that the game could never pull off the same sort of polished experience that you might get from a Battlefield game or some other AAA studio. However, it was trying something new, and in a climate where the Battlefield marketing campaign had essentially told gamers they were uneducated and that they shouldn't buy Battlefield 5, many were looking for a viable alternative. This bought a lot of goodwill with communities, and in fact it gave World War III a platform that maybe it wouldn't have had without that failure from Battlefield 5. That is what gave World War III that platform in the first place, alongside the fact that it did look like an interesting project, with some legs and a lot of content that we could get our teeth into. Secondly, there might be some people watching this video that still play World War III and are hoping for it to come back, and to you I apologise for calling it a dead game. By dead game I mean that it just doesn't have a solid player base anymore, and the chances of it being revived are fairly low. That doesn't mean it won't be revived. Maybe the developers will get back on board with the project and maybe have a free weekend or a free couple of weeks and a couple of new game modes, but from what I've seen it seems to be all over. So what happened? For a short time the game was quite good. It released with a lot of hype, as I mentioned before, which is often to the detriment of projects such as this. But hey, alongside many other players, I was ready to give it a chance. Then came news of a patch. The game was supposed to be patched regularly, bringing bug fixes and any sort of update that would improve the game alongside some content, and that's what you'd expect from a game like this. But this patch was not a good one. Early November 2018, I seem to remember, the patch messed everything up. Apparently, the patch broke the game for over 50% of players, including myself, leading to game instability, broken matchmaking, and a few other bugs and glitches. The main issue was definitely the matchmaking though. What can you do, even as a hardcore fan, if the game will not let you join servers with other players in? There's literally nothing you can do. You can have all the goodwill in the world, but sitting in an empty server can only provide so much entertainment, and that is why we see player numbers of under 50 currently today. The game lost players and went from around 5,000 concurrent players, maybe even more, on weekends to just a couple of hundred within the week, and as I said, it's been bleeding out ever since to 0 the other week, but it averages around 30 to 50. Okay, so it had a problem and lost some players. Big deal, games have come back from worse and the developers could patch it and move on. Being an early access game on PC, a patch could be delivered very quickly without too much trouble. Well, that is what most people thought, but it turned out that the patch never came, or at least didn't come in time. The forums were jam-packed with players complaining of an inability to join servers as you'd expect, but no answer came from the developers, or at least when it did come, they failed to address the actual problems, stating that they did not see any complaints. Many people thought the servers had been hacked or something had happened over at Farm 51 where they were developing the game. Maybe developers had just taken the money and run and didn't want to update the game or put any more effort into fixing it. I don't know what happened. All I can tell you is that the players disappeared because they just simply couldn't join servers. The game currently has a handful of players online and is not in any position to make a comeback. It's a shame and an ominous statement for what could come in following years with similar projects. I always take a look at PUBG with stuff like this, and yes, it's a one-off game that did something very special that I can't see being replicated in the future, but it's a good example of a passion project that was wildly successful, and despite the consistent criticisms of its bugs and flaws, the game is incredibly popular and wildly successful across the globe. It even has a thriving esports scene, and paved the way for many other popular battle royales to come along too. That was not a huge AAA game, yet the direction was clear. Ideally, that is what we'd like to see with games such as World War III, but the fact that the developers made a killing off initial sales due to the probably unexpected hype generated from a poor Battlefield marketing campaign and a fairly dry gaming landscape at the time, I can't imagine things will change anytime soon. I'm always waiting for the next Battlefield to come along. Insurgency is something that I've been following fairly closely, but again, it hasn't taken off. It's quite a good game, it's quite a good project, but I need something that is really going to be on all platforms, consoles and PC, and playable by the majority. As a content creator, it has to be something interesting. And whilst people will criticise games like Battlefield for what they are, and maybe Armour, a slightly different take, or Squad, a slower paced game, at least they do have large player bases and a team behind them that is intent on developing the game consistently. Whether for the good or the bad, they're always there to change things and try and make it a better experience, and that is what World War III suffered from. The minute something went wrong, everyone seemed to jump ship, and they had no intent on bringing it back. Let's take a quick look at some of the more recent Steam reviews. Whilst you do have to be careful with reviews, especially on Steam, as they often give a false impression of the game and often relate to some recent update that annoyed players, in this case is probably the one I was talking about earlier, it does allow you to get an insight into what has happened over time and can be fairly entertaining as many players complain about certain things. I've put a couple on screen for you now. One interesting review that I think is worth repeating as these things play in the background. Somebody was taking a look at the game and said, "I can feel a great shooter trying to claw its way out of an unbelievably janky mess. As of right now, I wouldn't recommend it," which is fair enough. I wouldn't recommend the game either, until at least you can actually get online and play it. The good, gunplay is great, customizations, lots of customization for everything, vehicles, soldiers, weaponry. As I mentioned in my review video, it's better than I've had in any other game. It's so in-depth and really fun. The scale of the maps seem to be quite well fitting, and whilst the game could be arguably a slower tactical game for people who don't like the arcadey Battlefield or Call of Duty style of gunplay, it still is quite satisfying, and it really kicks the Battlefield 3 and 4 nostalgia right into gear, probably down to the setting, the scenario, and the art style of the game. Movement is very janky, and it feels like it's an early version of PUBG if you've ever played that. Janky is the correct word. It's a bit slow and you get stuck on things, but it can be worked around and you'd expect that to improve over time. There's also some very odd things that have been thrown into the game and not quite optimized properly, like the score streaks. Those abilities seem to be a little bit out of place in a game like this. When it gets onto the bad, the extremely bad, you can't get into a game, you can't play online, there's an inconsistent time to kill and lots of lag, desync, and the servers tend to be a bit rubbish. Spawn locations, they're not very good. The maps themselves, whilst they are fairly well designed to some extent, there's a lot of balance issues, especially made a lot more evident on servers that have 10 people on them as opposed to the usual 60 plus. The sound was always a bit off for me, and in this review as well on Steam, complaining of sound. I couldn't really say it was the worst I've ever played, especially with BF5 having no footsteps for the most part when the game was released, but it's not exactly perfect. And also, I said earlier, there are a couple of issues with the game, the armor system, things like that. They're just not completely optimized and haven't had the feedback they need in order to be good in a game like this. And it simply points at the fact that the developers bit off more than they could chew with this game. It's not only a sandbox Battlefield style game, it's got loads of new things in there, alongside the fact you have soldiers, infantry, vehicles, tanks, even the possibility of air vehicles coming in, drones, squad call-ins, all sorts of stuff happening on a large map, and that is a lot to try and sort out as a developer. The word potential comes to mind. Is exactly what this game has, and it just didn't live up to it. It's unfortunate, but it's a lesson learned, and if a game comes out like this in the future, I implore you not to pre-order it. Definitely buy it when it's out, but don't pre-order because it sends the wrong impression to the developers. They use that money to then build the game. Often it's pocketed, the game fails, they make a runner or they don't choose to fix it, and you're left with a game that you can't play with just a few hours invested. Hopefully you enjoyed this video. Let me know what you think of World War III down in the comments below. I've heard many people have bought it but haven't played it, or if they have, only for a few hours. I'm interested to see what you say. We'll be back onto Battlefield content with the next video, but a nice change of pace to take a look at World War III, a game that I thought would be successful, but I've been proved wrong, and it has in fact failed. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next video.